May God be praised, and let us go forward with Mary. Good evening and a holy evening to all of you, my dear children, who are listening to Radio Domina Nostra. Tonight in All Evidence, we are talking about a theologically complicated topic, but one that is really under the eyes of the entire world. We are talking about the book that has just been published from PM Publications by Diego Fusaro, a philosopher, analyst, essayist, well-renowned throughout Italy, entitled La fine del cristianesimo, the end of Christianity, a subtitle that is very significant as it synthesizes an enormous volume of more than 400 pages, the death of God in the time of the global market and Pope Francis. We could say the two defendants, which are rightly the global market, which Diego Fusaro investigates in the ample first part of the book, and the so-called Pope Francis, who, in order for us not to be confused, in my mind, is not really Pope, as he has not been validly elected. He is guiding a revolution, as Diego Fusaro demonstrates in the second part. The book is not divided into two parts. I've done that for convenience. A theme in the second part that concerns chapters 7 to 11. He is seen as the one who's responsible for the capitulation of today's Christianity. It is a profoundly grave issue that cannot be ignored, but that unfortunately encounters the total embargo from the media. That is, if we examine the media, we understand that never like today, the church is alive. It is a church that is loved by the world, which opens its doors, which speaks the so-called green language, very dear to world powers, syncretism, globalism, etc. As Mr. Fusaro, there are other analysts that we will not have the possibility to talk about tonight, for example, Andrea Ricciardi, Matuzzi, and others who author books on the serious and real crisis of modern Christianity. Tonight, particularly, we will concern ourselves with what I defined as the second section of the book. In my view, the most compelling, maybe because I am personally involved in the themes contained in this book titled La fine del cristianesimo, that is, the end of Christianity. That is in chapters 7 to 11. I suggest a personal reading from the first part, which is the one that will serve as a platform from which we engage in other considerations. Diego Fusaro exposes his concern in the crisis of Roman Catholicism, the papacy, and so on. Chapters 7 to 11 have the following titles: The Sunset of the Church of Rome, from Vatican II to Bergoglio. In this chapter, Fusaro engages in considering a dependence between the solutions and the propositions of Vatican Council II and Bergoglio, who is practically radicalizing them. On the other hand, chapter 8 is titled St. Peter's Empty Balcony. St. Peter's balcony is empty, and therefore we have the issue of Joseph Ratzinger and his resignation. I will read you the title of paragraph 2. Quote, Ratzinger, the pontiff, defeated by nihilism. After an ample and well-articulated reflection, Fusaro, in the last 3 chapters, states the 𝐥'𝐿 with respect to modern Christianity. Here are the titles. Post-Christianity, the subordination to the mundus. I was talking about this in the morning. Fusaro speaks about a post-Christianity, that is, we're in the presence of the possibility that now Christianity is born, and it is not the 2,000-year-old one that we know. It is something new, and he speaks about it abundantly when he starts to reflect on the time of the Antichrist. Then in the last few chapters, the last 2, subordination to the mundus. Maybe this is from the point of view of the thematic explanation. It is the most interesting because it talks about the auto-neutralization of Christianity. And at the end, we have chapter 11, the post-Christian neo-church. I must say, a book that talks about the end of Christianity without opening a ray of hope for survival could appear, let's say, a little baleful. There is a conclusion that I find paradigmatic, which recalls, if I may be allowed, in all humility, the qualitative difference there might be between me and the philosopher. Fusaro, even for a spiritual resistance. I invite you to start the reading of the book from its conclusion, because at the end, in the last concluding section, Fusaro lays the foundation for a renaissance, for which we are all hoping. And now we have said this, I'd like to say hello to Fusaro, who relates to us online. Good evening, Fusaro. Good evening to all, and a greeting from Diego Fusaro to all of you. Thank you for accepting our invitation. We already have spoken on our YouTube channel, had a couple of chats. People do not like the word chat, but I like it very much. It gives me a sense of relaxation, even if we are dealing with very delicate matters. I thank you for having me as a guest on your YouTube page. I will start directly by asking, what has enticed you to write this book? Thank you. First of all, it is me who must thank you for the excellent work that you are doing on the confessional plane, but also on the plane of reason. Yours is a battle which is very appreciated even by men of reason, and not so much of faith. Therefore, for me, it's a pleasure to be able to converse, a term which I like, even more than the word chat, to be truthful. Conversing gives the Platonic idea of confrontation and of the pleasure of dialogue. And so now I will answer your question right away. My book, The End of Christianity, stems from a reflection during a long period of time on the relationship between fanaticism of the economic market and the religion of transcendence. This was a thesis that I have matured over time, according to which the techno-capitalist powers do not need religion in any way, does not only not look for an equilibrium with it, nor a compromise. In order to be able to function as a full regime, it must dismiss it. It must favor its evaporation, as I have defined it in my book. Furthermore, I like the term evaporation compared more to end, which has also been chosen editorially as a title, because the word end seems peremptory. Evaporation, on the other hand, alludes to a process taking place that can still be, as we all hope, to be eventually stopped. Therefore, from here derives my text from stricto sensu philosophical research, which I was developing for a long time, which I came to in some way in 2013, that cataclysm that happened in the Church of Rome, which at that moment did not seem so important as in fact it was. We cannot understand what was happening, at least for those who are not intertwined with the events in the church in Rome. Surely it was something of historical proportions. Right away I understood that we had arrived now of redirationem, between Christian civilization and the world that did not want it any longer. That on the other hand, it was trying to dismiss it. So from the very beginning, I noticed that while Ratzinger tried with every power to resist the civilization of nothingness, which did not want either reason nor Christianity any longer, and for this it attracted immediately my adhesion and my sympathy. A term that we may use in its Greek meaning from the very beginning, I found myself agreeing with Ratzinger's positions, as from a different point of view from which I was operating from. They're the same opposition which was coming against the civilization of nothingness, of relativism, of the dictatorship of relativism, and of the of techno-capitalism. That was understood from the very beginning, and we could perceive Bergoglio's role as a ferryman of Christianity towards the precipice of nothingness, as a normalizer, a decaffeinator, and anesthesiologist of Christianity. Therefore, the first purely philosophical research came to unite itself with the one tied to the concrete life of the Church of Rome, and so the book was born. Comprised of two parts, as we were saying, but that aspires to be one complete unit. There's a first part that analyzes the enmity between the sacred and irreverent civilization of capitalism. And there is a second part that is focused, on the other hand, on the issues of the Church after the Vatican Council II, all the way to the neo-Church, that of the liberal progressive Bergoglio, whom, in my view, is an outpost of atheism in our society of consumerism. Regarding this mention that you make of the Vatican Council II in chapter 7 of the book, you attribute to Vatican Council II alone, as seen on page 226, to the inclusive neutralizing process of relativism. What would you like to explain to us? In what sense do you intend this? And why is there a return to Vatican Council II as a panacea, as we can call it, towards all the ills and the damages that the Church and Christianity are living? This is an aspect that is important to clarify. Yes, with immense pleasure. Yes, there's a chapter of my book which is dedicated exactly to Vatican Council II. And Vatican Council II is a very decisive moment in this plan that leans towards today's liberal and neo-progressive Church. Naturally, yes, it was a moment of reform. Many in the beginning believed unsuspectingly that it was a positive process, and it was difficult to understand the effects in real time. Two bastions of critical thought with respect to these processes, as they have revealed themselves, were von Balthasar, and on one end, and who talked about the need to break down the bastions. Yes, indeed. And Ratzinger himself, on the other hand, who held moderately progressive views with respect to those that he would later adopt. They saw in Vatican Council II a possibility of modernization that would allow the survival of Christianity and to conquer the world. This, let us say, was at the beginning the objective, which seemed a very noble one. The idea that Christianity, in order not to remain behind with respect to the world, in order not to remain isolated and lose the faithful, could open to the world and become worldly. Nonetheless, we know, ex post, that process of opening towards the world did not conquer the world for Christianity, but brought it to become lost to the world. So this is the movement, certainly, that I see in Vatican Council II. So this theological program, Fusaro, for those of us who are responsible for the work and who are on the front lines, there is also another type of interpretation. Naturally, we cannot speak about it in this context, obviously. You don't talk about it all the time, but when one talks about this capitulation of Catholic identity with respect to the modern world, there's always a reference for those who are doing the work to the third secret of Fatima. I dare to say, towards an interpretation that is supernatural. But this is not the context in which to speak about this. Instead, I wanted to ask you, always thinking about the pages of your book, could you explain to us how in chapter 8 you were able to place Ratzinger as a catechontic element in the face of this Vatican Council II post-council tendency, both as prefect of the faith, you quote the Dominus Jesus, and as Pope. Please explain to us in detail this passage from the relativist drift of Vatican Council II to the Ratzingerian Catechon of chapter 8, with which you mention. Yes, certainly, we can understand this transition better referring to von Balthasar, an author who is very dear to you and that you quote very often. To me, it seems an optimal thing together with Ratzinger. Both started from moderately open positions towards the idea of the council, and they found themselves taking another look at their initial judgments. Von Balthasar spoke of a belt line, a longing, a desire for the world as a cipher to the new spirit of Christianity. And the same Ratzinger apparently said that it was a mistake to open up to the world without filters. In other words, towards the dominant modern mentality. He used this expression, and substantially, the way I interpret it, his pontificate, but we could say also say something already convergent for what pertains to his theoretical production before 2005, was an attempt to resist this beltline, this desire of the world, trying to call attention on tradition, on the impossibility to render Christianity more modern, if from modernization we intend to make it compatible with the zeitgeist, with the spirit of time. It is quite evident that if Christianity is the Word of God, the idea of modernizing it, renewing it, rendering it compatible with the present, means necessarily to betray it. In some way, this is the deceit of the neo-progressive and liberal church of Bergoglio, which opens Christianity to the world. It tries to modernize it and render it convergent with the world. In doing so, it causes it to melt and to dissolve into the world itself. Therefore, many of the battles waged by Ratzinger are battles of opposition with respect to the Beltline and the modernization of Christianity. For example, Ratzinger insisted, there is the theme of the non-negotiable values. The theme of non-negotiable values is the one of the philosophical, theological themes which are most important, in my view, of Ratzinger's battle, that, as we know, has as a theme the opposition to the dictatorship of relativism. That dictatorship of relativism that today is the fulcrum of the spirit of our times. It is a dictatorship because it does not admit other possibilities. It sanctions them as fanatical, as violent, as metaphysically dangerous, and so on. This is one aspect, but then there's also the idea that Ratzinger was able to articulate this theme, according to which the Christian and the pontiff himself cannot reinvent Christianity according to likes or according to the spirit of the times, as if it were something to interpret liberally according to the historical moment. Ratzinger said many times that Christianity was the Word of God, and as such, as the depositum fidei, the responsibility of the good Christian and of the Pope, much more, was that of transmitting, maintaining the Word of God alive. This is the fundamental point that emerges from the magisterium. On the other hand, with Bergoglio, without anyone noticing it, we are in the presence, but let us talk about this in a bit. It was only a thought in Amoris Laetitia, apart from all the relevant pastoral aspects concerning divorced and remarried couples. We are in the presence of a clear contradiction of the Gospels. You, Fusaro, at a certain point, still in chapter 8, affirm, in reality, the balcony of St. Peter. We want to remind all of you who are listening, we are more than 2,000 now. The balcony of St. Peter indicates the lodge of St. Peter, where the Pope looks out on the Piazza San Pietro. You write, the balcony of St. Peter remaining empty and the pontiff resigning in all effects looks like, and this has really struck me deeply, like the defeat of the Church of Rome and of Christianity. This is one of the most important passages. In the face of market globalization, you said it's before Bergoglio came out of the balcony to say to everyone, good evening. Exactly, the same idea, and so it was perceived. The empty balcony, the resignation, gave the effect of a great defeat of Christianity. If you would like, you would find a ante litteram representation of this in that film of Nanni Moretti, Habemus Papam, correct? Nanni Moretti anticipates, just as in Palombella Rossa, the end of communism, and with Habemus Papam, he anticipates what will later happen with Ratzinger. This is a fact, Fusaro. And you might know very well that after Ratzinger's death, they tried to make people believe that he resigned because he did not have the energy any longer, because he had personal problems, insomnia, and all those things. The version we have of the facts is this one, and it is being reproposed just like in the movie that you've just mentioned by Nanni Moretti, and there is no question about this. Yes, of course, certainly, naturally, the thesis that I am proposing is convergent with your own. The one that you have developed in Peter, Where Are You? Which is a reference text that I have had the pleasure of citing in my new book, together with that of Andrea Cionci. Ratzinger never backed out. That was not the defeat of Ratzinger. Ratzinger only stepped to the side to be able to continue the fight much more efficiently. We can see it was an epic gesture, a gesture of intelligence to make his action more efficient. As we know, Odysseus has a different courage than that of Achilles. That of Achilles is the courage of aggression. That of Odysseus is the courage which deviates from action to render it more efficacious. On this note, as we know, while Ratzinger was renouncing the ministerium and not the munus, he checkmated Bergoglio, and he continued to resist rampant nihilism. This is my thesis. Therefore, it is not at all the end of Christianity, nor the defeat of Christianity. It will not be such until there will be a little Catholic remnant, like the one you have, as a point of reference to all those who follow you, in my view. We must create a united front with this remnant, in the name of reason and faith, to resist the barbarity of a world that does not know what to do anymore with reason and faith, which are daily being humiliated and mortified. And the thesis that I'm proposing is exactly this. Fusaro, you state that very clearly on page 288. You say exactly this. According to this interpretive line, Ratzinger renounces, not because he is defeated, but in the opposite way, not to be defeated, so as not to buckle under the evaporation of Christianity. Exactly, and the thesis which I sustain in my book, The End of Christianity, is that Ratzinger would carry out that historical gesture of 2013 because he was not defeated. Not to be defeated in the face of slithering liquid atheism, even inside the church, in front of the powers of nihilistic globalization that was openly operating against him. Suffice to say that the hate shown towards him from the media and from the proponents of exclusive thought in order not to be defeated, Ratzinger makes this move. He makes a winged step. He continues to fight. He does not run away in front of the wolves, using the same image that he himself employed in 2005, but he continues to fight and to fulfill the role of the katechon, of the restraining power with respect to the spread of infamous powers of the neoliberal and relativist globalization. Therefore, that gesture of 2013 acquires a fundamental function, in my view, because it divides a church that is liked, that wants to be liked by God, the little remnant, the little flock that, while Ratzinger, that are following Ratzinger, want to please God, from the other reality, the neoliberal progressive church, Bergoglio's Sanhedrin, the neo church that wants to please the world, and that the world likes because this is what it's all about. Certainly. I'm sure people have asked themselves why Bergoglio is so well liked by the same individuals that have never hidden their hatred, their disdain towards Ratzinger, since he has become Pope until the time of his death. We must be aware of this also. My thesis is that Ratzinger couldn't do anything different. Either he would end up in some way ousted, remaining at the margins with respect to a world that did not want Christianity any longer, or maybe with that gesture, brilliantly conceived, placing himself in the impeded see, in the sede impedita, and renouncing the ministerium, but not the munus. He was clearly separating the real church, his church, from the neoliberal, progressive church of the anti-Pope Bergoglio, and of all the non-Christians. But fundamentally, I take the liberty in saying whomever follows Bergoglio's neo-church, whoever identifies himself in those messages, they are not Christian. The true Christian today must be in opposition to the world of relativism and nihilism. Many times Ratzinger has stated this. Today the Christian finds himself in opposition. Being Christian means giving testimony against a world of falsehood and relativism. A Christian who finds himself at ease in this world, like the Christian under the times of Bergoglio, is simply not a Christian. He is a simple adherent of the dogmas of the neoliberal globalization, which in all cases Bergoglio is asking us to follow. As Bergoglio sees him, the good Christian is simply a good consumer that adheres to the modules of relativist globalization, is against sovereignty, against populism, is for open ports and borders, and roots for the openness so dear to the defenders of capitalism. Certainly, we must make a mention related to those themes, and to our dear friend and journalist Andrea Cionci, whom you're talking about in your book, and who's done a superb job in examining this theme. On the other hand, I wanted to ask you, at a certain point, you talk about the prophecy of 𝐶 of Pasolini, in other words, of a nihilism that successfully annihilates these two great enemies. Do you want to explain this to us better? You talk about this in your book. Yes, I must say that my book about Christianity is very much indebted to Pasolini's lesson. In my view, Pasolini was one of the non-confessional secular authors who described in the best way the profound vaporization of Christianity, as well as the liquidation of the sacred in a technological society. Rather, it could be the fil rouge by which we could interpret Pasolini's cinematography, poetry, and literary works, the disappearance of the sacred from the theorem until 𝐶, as we said. 𝐶 is Pasolini's last film, deliberately unviewable, because unviewable is the world that represents the world of the civilization of consumerism. In that film, Pasolini shows a villa of horrors that demonstrates the full continuity between the totalitarianisms of the 1900s and the civilization of consumerism, being its continuation in a paradoxically pejorative way. An old theme that Pasolini has illustrated more than once, stating that real totalitarianism is not at our backs, but is in front of us. It is the totalitarianism of the civilization of consumerism, which shows as imperfect the terrible totalitarianisms that have characterized the 1900s, and that Pasolini had also experienced in his own life. And therefore the Villa of Horrors of 𝐶 shows some individuals doing a roundup of young girls and boys, bringing them to this villa, torturing their bodies. They force them to coprophagic acts, which are an image of the society of consumerism, which really forces good consumers to eat inedible foods with crazy euphoria. On the other hand, Pasolini had not yet seen the scenes of the worms and grasshopper larvae on dinner tables, but the civilization of consumerism does this perfectly, does it not? They allow us to eat all vile things happily. Pasolini represents this magnificently. There are two scenes in that film that are absolutely splendid in my view. The first one where Pasolini shows a young man and a young woman making love in the inside of this villa. In this villa, it is not allowed to love, but only to enjoy. Clears the image of the society of consumerism that produces only pornography and unlimited enjoyment, where there's never love as a project, dedicating oneself to the other, nothing that is geared towards creation and that is long-lasting. These two young souls are shot to death, and before being shot, one of the two raises his hand as a closed fist, a sign of the communist ideal that is being killed by the society of consumerism. In other scenes, we are shown some young girls immersed in tubs of dejection, and one of them, with her eyes looking at the sky and citing the Gospel of Mark, exclaims, my God, why have you abandoned us?" With this theme, Pasolini shows us how the society of consumerism, if left to proceed motu proprio on its own, submerges Christianity as well as communism and makes them evaporate in such dejection. It is a movie that precedes 1989, when the society of consumerism has overwhelmed the communist world that today has become, in great part, an internal aspect of this same society of consumerism. And this is what is happening, in my view, with Christianity. With a Christianity that increasingly is internal to this paradigm of commoditization. It is in these days that the flammable connection of the Catholics has arrived, the Catholic match, which is an application to allow meetings online. What better form of the evaporation of Christianity, and what a better example of what Pasolini used to say. And further, Bergoglio's neo-church is in some way perfectly coherent with this discussion of the evaporation of Christianity, as in fact it renders the Christian indistinguishable from the consumer. Bergoglio's proposition is a low-cost faith, a smart, fluid religion with brief homilies, as they should not be too long, and they should not perturb productive times of consumerism and of the production of goods. The Latin Mass is not there anymore because it is itself incompatible. Soon what will be recognized as the only Mass is the English Mass of the markets, and so on. Therefore, I believe that Pasolini hit the bullseye then with regards to what is happening in our days. What a marvel. All this really makes us think, mostly because it is said by one that does not profess Catholic religion. Even so, your vision is so clear. Unfortunately, I say this as a person who is an insider and that has been put in the corner, as you know. I see it referring to bishops, to priests and theologians who seem not to be aware of this drift. In chapter 10, I believe it's titled Subordination to the Mundus. You use an expression that is not new at all. You talk about the perestroika of the Catholic Church. This is not at all new because two analysts, I don't know if you know of them, one has died, his name is Palmaro, and the other one, I cannot remember his name now. They've written a book titled Sleeping Beauty, referring to the Catholic Church. Gnocchi, here it is, Gnocchi Palmaro. And they published before anyone else, mentioning a perestroika of the Church, and the theme is very compelling. You write, with the rising to the pontificate of Jorge Mario Bergoglio on March 13, 2013, with the name of Pope Francis, a clear turning point was registered. We passed through the adaptation to the order of the mundus. In other words, you make us understand clearly what Ciąci and I highlighted and sustained from both our views, that it was a manipulated and therefore invalid election desired by the powerful globalists who are at the service of the logic of the world markets, that wanted and are transforming Roman Catholicism into a sort of branch of globalist power. In all evidence, you shared this thesis, and you even developed it in chapter 10. Yes, it is. So I'm convinced that this analogy between Gorbachev and Bergoglio is very fruitful. It is useful to mention concerning the differences between the two characters in question and between the two contexts in question as substantially, as many might remember, what was saluted as the perestroika, literally the renovation, the modernization of the Soviet Union, initiated by Gorbachev, meant in reality the burial of the Soviet Union, its inglorious end, its settlement under the nothingness of relativist civilization, the one that the following year, the end of communism, was utilizing Gorbachev as a testimonial for commercials for Pizza Hut. Similarly, the one that Bergoglio proposes, mutatis mutandi, is a perestroika of the Catholic Church. He promotes its modernization, its change, internal reform, but in fact it produces the same effect as was created by perestroika. It brings the Church towards its own liquefaction. So it is a fruitful analogy which can be developed. I do not say anything new, obviously, if I say that Bergoglio, like Gorbachev, was liked from the very beginning by the representatives of the new liberal Western modernists. Since the very beginning, Gorbachev was sanctified when he died in 2022 as a true and tried hero from the perspective of the West. As we understand, a real catastrophe, a cataclysm from the point of view of the Soviet Union. If one considers that life expectancy was lowered, if I remember, by 7 years, approximately, for inhabitants. They found themselves in a condition that many say to be not excellent at all. And surely it was not they found themselves in a condition of total misery back in the 1990s and so on.
condizione di miseria totale negli anni 90 e così via. Analogamente, la
Certainly.
perestroica di
In the same way, Bergoglio's perestroika is destroying the church, as it does not allow it to live again, to be reborn. On the contrary, the opening of the church does not bring new sheep to the flock, but sends away the few that remained. It melts Christianity into consumerism, because if Christianity reiterates the same ideals of the society of consumerism, what need is there for Christianity at this point? This society of consumerism should be enough. Why should a young man today be enthusiastic about Christianity if commercials, successful singers, and media are saying the same things? It becomes a futile doubling that empties itself out increasingly of Christianity. This aspect of Bergoglio really astonishes us. There's never an opening towards the transcendent, towards the sacred, the eternal. One talks only about migrants in terms of aligning towards the neoliberal globalization ideal. One talks about green issues of the fight against populism. In some, Bergoglio assumes the image of a forest ranger, an operator of a non-profit organization, a leader of a liberal and progressive party. There's never in him a trace of a man of faith, much less of a high-level exponent of an institution such as the Roman Catholic Church. This is what is noticeable about Bergoglio and his perestroika. Yes. Oh, he was a wonderful healthcare leader during the epidemic. He invited everyone to get vaccinated as a act of love. But forgive me. You can do an act of love if you have informed consent. Love is not forced. So words must be used very carefully in this context. Well, this whole story of the vaccine is a very long one. As a matter of fact, he's lost hundreds of thousands of followers. But I like that, and I was quoting his statement on the vaccine because I found it very interesting that you see in Bergoglio and in his politics, which we were talking about, and its applicative aspects, the application of Nietzsche's theorem, according to which this would be a church that goes against what Christ has preached and announced. It is a very strong statement. I'm saying this, and I'm not hiding my point of view. This is the statement that should be supported. I think I'll repeat it many times. And here we have the anti-Christic theme. You make a statement according to Nietzsche's theorem, with which I was not familiar with. I want to ask you if you can please explain to us a little bit more to show what Pope Francis, in some ways, promoting that ecclesiastical structure that goes against what Christ combated and has taught us to combat. Did I understand it correctly? Exactly that. But before expanding on that theme, I will talk a little on the theme of vaccines. An article was published on Vatican News during the summer on August 12th, 2022, which said, COVID, vaccines are an act of love to save each other together. Even for men of reason, a fact stands out clearly that the verb to save each other would be applied to vaccines when, as you teach us, to be saved is a very important value for Christians. We are totally within a completely different church here, the church of science, the parish of technology. It is a completely different thing. It is astonishing that these words are utilized in Vatican News. For a Christian to be saved means to be saved by faith through Christ and not through a technological expedient that at most could guarantee your health. Incredibly good thing if this happens, but if you think salvation is synonymous with the health of the body, well, you understand that it has nothing to do with Christianity. There we are. In my book, The End of Christianity, I quote Nietzsche quite a bit, as well as the Nietzschean theorem of the death of God. And I venture to say that the final act of Bergoglio's pontificate could be 𝐥'𝐞𝐗, his coming out over St. Peter's balcony and saying, quoting Nietzsche, good evening, as he clearly says in that style of Mike Buongiorno, dressed in white, but saying, good evening, God is dead. There you are. This is the conclusion worthy of this farce, because we are dealing with a farce, so the one we are facing since 2013. A Christianity reduced to a low-cost faith, and Nietzsche allows us to understand this also. Nietzsche wrote a book, The Antichrist. In my view, and I believe he was much more Christian than Bergoglio and his neo-church. This because the Antichrist would never appear saying, I am the Antichrist. In the Antichristic literature, on the contrary, the Antichrist always presents himself as simia Dei, a perfect forgery of Christ and of the divine. Therefore, not in the Nietzschean way of the Antichrist. In the fragments published by Nietzsche's sister after his death, titled The Will of Power, he writes, the Church has become all that Christ combats against and has taught us to combat. Why is this? In the meantime, Nietzsche had a profound veneration for the figure of Christ and a profound disdain for Christianity as an institution. Understood? But this Nietzschean formulation, in my view, is not valid, but is valid referring to Bergoglio's neo-church, which is exactly the opposite of what Christ said and did. We could do a careful analysis of all these fundamental aspects. Meanwhile, Bergoglio stated that we must obey institutions. He said this at least twice. As I look back in my book, The End of Christianity, Christ does not obey institutions. He only obeys God. He comes into conflict with institutions while remaining faithful to God. Furthermore, if we want to say more, Christ touched lepers and healed them. Bergoglio, on the other hand, in the name of a therapeutic religion, suspends his travels, stating we need to respect the ban on celebrating masses due to the health emergency, and so on. Therefore, Bergoglio's neo-church is really opposed to Christ's church. Another theme which they discussed a lot was that of open immigration. A contemporary theologian whose theology frankly reminds me of a do-it-yourself bricolage, a Kia-style theology, said that God is always an open port. I'm sure he did not want it to be, blasphemy in my view, but it was a completely inadequate definition. This because in the sacred texts we read, knock and it shall be opened. And with this we presume there might be closed doors that will open or will not open according to the context. It was not say that open ports and traffic of low-cost labor, because this is the capitalism of which we are dwellers. So from this point of view also, Bergoglio's vision is contrary to the one of Christ and Christianity in its origins. While Christ was in some way in conflict with the powers that offend the divine, think of the episode of the expulsion of the merchants and the money changers from the temple. It is not by chance that Bergoglio, aside from not so challenging phrases against finance capitalism, in the end, does not say anything substantial on these themes. On the other hand, not by chance, he loves Martin Luther. You wrote that Bergoglio possesses a sort of Luther mania, and I believe this is a very poignant statement, because Luther is also the one who theorizes the subordination of the Christian to power. Luther is the one who incites princes to massacre farmers in revolt. Bergoglio's neo-church is completely subordinate to the powers of neoliberal globalization, to the Plutarchs of neo-capitalism. And this is remarkably interesting. Ratzinger was not. He warned us against the powers of finance and media. Ratzinger always placed Christ and God in the center, which is not the case of neoliberal globalization.
della finanza e del sistema mediatico, ad esempio. Ratzinger sempre mise al centro Dio e Cristo e non la globalizzazione neoliberale.
Surely, yes, he is famous. I say it all the time, almost to laugh a little. But Bergoglio's declaration is quite dramatic. Given to a Latin American journalist who asked him which were his biggest worries a few years ago, and to this he responded, "Oh, well, the aquifers in Congo and the trees of the Amazon." And he has to report this, not this declaration, but the fact that Bergoglio, anytime he is scrutinized, is worried more about the climate emergency than anything else. Listen, Fusaro, given the fact that when we talk about things that are always so interesting and beautiful, time flies by very rapidly and we only have 10 minutes left at our disposal. Until at 10:15 exactly 11 minutes. I wanted to ask you another couple of things to conclude this beautiful dialogue, this conversation. First of all, very unexpectedly from me, you are a little conciliatory in the tale of chapter 11, paragraph 5. I did not expect this title because it says a pope in brackets, and this could be okay. Then it says, with views close to heresy, and you place a question mark here. Then, reading the paragraph, I cheered up a little bit because at the end, asking that question, you also give the answer. In other words, Bergoglio is clearly heretical. You are a philosopher, but you do not need much while reading your book to understand that you also have realized, as an outsider, that Bergoglio is not at all the representative of the 2,000-year-old depositum fidei of the Church. After this, I'll ask you one more thing, one last question in the conclusion. Yes, the chapter has a question to create in some way in the reader a desire to discover, let us say, then, naturally, as you were reminding us, the answer that I give, Bergoglio is close to, or I would say, clearly follows towards heresy. I say this without paraphrasing, reconnecting myself, exactly to your excellent work on Peter, Where Are You? So it is that way, in my view, that Bergoglio's position in many cases ends up to be total heresy. Just like one example, he gives much importance to the figure of Judas, which we know is not a friend. The word used by Bergoglio, Judas, is not a friend, and even if it were true that it is of a Dantesque origin of hell to see him at the bottom, at the very lowest places of hell, in any case, we know he is not a friend, and he's not a very commendable figure, by the way, as he appears to Bergoglio. Bergoglio, who professed himself to be very passionate about this character. Also, there's the issue of the Pachamama, where we have pure and obvious idolatry, a retrieval of the Paganitas, an idolatry which places under discussion all the solid tenets of Christianity. You have no other God except me, and therefore it is evident that this is a heretical gesture. I would not know how else to define it. Furthermore, not to be quiet about the rehabilitation of the image of Martin Luther, saluted as a sort of medicine for the Catholic Church. Now, that Luther might be a medicine could be said by a Protestant from his point of view, and it is quite comprehensible. But a Catholic who says that and a person that idolater should be the Pope, it is a real non sequitur. Also, according to what has been reported from the dialogues with Eugenio Scalfari, never contradicted by Bergoglio, even when it was contradicted by official Vatican news, Bergoglio never intervenes to disprove this. Jesus Christ is the figure of a perfect man, but not the Son of God. Therefore, we fall again into the Arian heresy. Ario's heresy negated the divine essence of the Son as the same as the Father. There are many other elements that allow me to say that Bergoglio's religion is not simply a religion of nothingness, which approximates religion of the individual who knows truly little about faith. Something that is very grave when we think of the role that he occupies, a dilator, that of the Pope. Here we are exactly dealing with what I define in the Nietzschean way in my book, a theology with the hammer. This is a theology that hammers on all points of solid Christian tradition and scatters the remnants in the air. Andrea Cionci would say it is a theology that reverses all in an opposite way. I limit myself in stating that it is a theology of the hammer that strikes the fundamental points of Christianity, and in the end, I repeat, renders Christianity to the one of the many bass drums of the neoliberal order of globalization, for which Bergoglio, in the end, does not believe in hell for the damned, but believes in their destruction. That's why maybe for him hell exists only for the populace, the sovereigntists, and those who protest globalization and neoliberalism. Yes, with respect to this aspect, I would see him as a subscriber, if not the leader, of a progressive liberal party. Yes, certainly this is a powerful exhibition of all of Bergoglio's heresies. And there are many of them. Unfortunately for us, listen, Fusaro, we are approaching the end of our interview. We only have 5 minutes left. I would like then to go right to the conclusion of your book. Many times during these past years, I've used a word from the Apocalypse, but there's a key word, to tell the truth, of the entire New Testament. It is a sort of password, the Greek word hypomone, which, as you know, means patience, perseverance, but it could also mean simply where in Apocalypse there is the final confrontation, correct? Also with Odysseus and the Odyssey, this virtue has been attributed to him: courage, forbearance, and constancy. Yes, so this term that we find in the Apocalypse is one that is much more incisive, together with that of the pistis, which I've already interpreted as the key word for resistance. But you go a bit further. I'm very happy about this, and I want to congratulate you, because if I understood correctly, you invite the little remnant and all Christians that for the first time are a minority with a kind of appeal. We are in the final statements of the book. I'm reading from page 422. The decisive word for you is much more important and much stronger, and that is the word insubordination. I cannot hide from you the fact that when I read this word, it really struck me. In other words, you invite to insubordination against the spirit of the world, the spirit of time. And it is and its principal theophobic determinations. Please explain to us what the theophobia is, even if we understand it. It is always good to make this explicit, and tell us also, if we only have this direction left, that of insubordination to the world powers, to the spirit of the world, to resist in order to save Christianity. Certainly, the world of contemporary finance and technology, of capital, and of concurring planetary markets is a world that is theophobic. In other words, it despises the divine. It is a hierophobic world that despises the sacred, a world that you must desecrate and render completely profane, because of the sacred, as I defined it in my book, The End of Christianity, is the unavailable. The world of technology foresees all things as being available, and therefore nothing can remain sacred. If everything must be on sale, nothing can remain sacred. From here, the constant desecration that theophobic society makes of all things and everyone. In the concluding part of my book, I exactly call upon insubordination, one that would unite the little remnant and the group of people who are not yet aligned, those who are not satisfied with the neoliberal globalization, those who feel something is missing and are not willing to bend in front of all these processes. My book starts from this thesis and concludes with the same thesis. Because, as you might remember in my book, there was a quotation in the opening by Pasolini that, as I was saying, is one of the references in the book. In his Corsair writings, Pasolini said, and I quote, "The church could be the grandiose guide, but not the authoritarian one of those who refuse." And here a Marxist is talking as a Marxist. Refuse the new power of consumerism that is more repressive than ever, corrupting and degrading. Never like today, Marx's statement has made more sense, in which capital transforms human dignity into goods of trade. It is this refusal, then, that could symbolize the Church, going back to the beginnings, to the opposition and to revolt. Either one does this, or must accept a power that does not want it anymore. In other words, suicide. Here, in my view, we have the antithesis between a church in revolt and a little remnant that does not bend down for the civilization of marketing, that rejects Christianity, and which is in revolt with respect to that world. Persecuted by that world, or maybe Bergoglio's now church, which has already committed suicide in the society of consumerism, melting and making itself at home in those comfortable spaces in the comfort zone of the neoliberal society. This is the fundamental aspect. Today, the conflict is a very different one than we had in the 1960s, 1970s. Today, the conflict is between a humanity gone down a landslide, floating in total nihilism and relativism, against a humanity that has not yet gone through this process and that still believes, that still trusts in reason, and still believes in something bigger than those markets, and that daily mortification of a calculating reason, which treats in the same way a public school, an investment bank, that treats the sacred as a simple object to be derided in the performance of the society of entertainment. All this creates scandal. It creates scandal in seeing the dehumanization of man happening daily. It creates scandal to see our history being ridiculed, if not to say cancelled. It creates scandal seeing our fundamental symbols, our roots, thrown on the street, only to be desecrated. In my view, which is why today it does not suffice to say no, a gesture that is not only of individual dissent. We need total insubordination and revolt in order not to take our own lives in that world that dehumanizes us. It makes us simply a prosthesis of nothingness. I offer you my congratulations, my best wishes, and the gratitude of 2,500 listeners. As I have been told, the viewership is much more than that, but for some unknown reason they appear less than that. In any case, there are 2,500 people listening who thank you, and more than some, actually many, have asked if it's possible to continue this kind of discussion in the near future, because, as you see, an hour has gone by very rapidly, and when it comes to themes examined according to the Logos, I thank you, Fusaro, and I wish you wonderful work, good health for you and your family. I invite our listeners to read the last editorial work by Fusaro, The End of Christianity. Thank you. Thank you again, mighty Fusaro, and to our staff, may God be praised, and let's go forward with Mary.